That works. So cool. So we're recording now. All right. So just some other general information about this class. So all of my classes are experiments in one way or another. This one's a little bit less experimental because I've taught this a couple times now and feel like I've gotten a good sense of what works for most people. So, you know, but I would also say, like, if there's something in particular you're looking to learn that I haven't shown you or something, please speak up and let me know. And I'm happy to, like, if I know how to cover things, I will. So, you know, this is especially with a class this small, it's like a good opportunity to do some like stuff that people on an individual level want to learn. So if there is something that you thought you would learn out of this, you aren't, just let me know and we'll make sure that we cover it. So objectives for this class, you know, this is not like a 3-credit course or anything like that, but I do try to teach it with some sort of objective in mind. The biggest thing for me is I want you guys to learn stuff by making things. So my hope for this class is that you guys make stuff, you share it in Slack, you share it on the internet. Like, you'll learn so much more, especially about machine learning, by just like doing it. So I think a lot of times people who get excited about machine learning are told, like, oh, you have to learn linear algebra, and then you have to learn PyTorch or TensorFlow. You have to like learn all this shit before you get to make it. And like, no one says you have to learn how pixels work before you get to work in Photoshop, right? So like, this is the deal with Runway, is like Runway, like, you need to know a little bit just to sort of get started and not be completely confused. But like, you can make stuff like in 20 minutes using Runway. And that's like, I want to get people started in the idea of just like, let's make some stuff and learn by making. As a part of this course, you will be learning a little bit about the basics of machine learning and how machines think or like process imagery. This is not like a machine learning, you know, intensive course where I like explain, you know, how like convolutional neural networks work or anything. But it is just, I hope, enough to get you sort of thinking about machine learning. And I find that quite often, like, there will be some piece of news throughout the next 5 weeks that you'll hear about how machine learning is fucking something up or doing something like poorly. And we'll be able to talk about that. And I hope you learn a little bit more to understand like why that might be the case. And then, you know, obviously this is a 5-week course, so it's pretty short. So at the very end of the class, like, we'll talk about sort of like, what's the next thing you can do? I end up teaching a lot of different classes. I teach pretty much always the same one through SSHH, just because it's more like for artists and intro folks, but I do teach other courses as well as have a bunch of other materials on my YouTube page. So there's a lot of opportunity to learn more if you get interested in a particular topic or just want to learn more about how machine learning works. So we'll do more of that in the last week of class. So this is the schedule for the next 5 weeks. I've changed this slightly based on previous feedback of previous classes. So I used to teach just 5 weeks of like lectures. And some of the feedback I got was like, I'd love to just have a last week where we can see everybody's work and talk about it. So I'm sort of going to compress the 5 weeks into 4 and then have the last week available to sort of just do a group share and show some work. So hopefully that means that you like now realize you have a little bit of time to like make some stuff and share things. And it's not like a professional critique or where you have to have everything polished. It'll just be like a really loose sort of like, here's what I played with, here's what I made. And then folks can sort of talk about like, oh, it'd be cool if you maybe did this too, or like, oh, have you thought about looking at this? So it'll be very loose. I don't expect anyone to be like the worst, like mean critique or whatever. It'll just be like a nice way to sort of see what people are working on and get ideas from that. So we'll talk a little bit about like what you could make or what you can work on between now and then, but just know that like maybe by the end, like have a couple projects to show off. And it can be something as I did a dumb, funny thing inside Runway and look what I made, all the way to like, I have this like really great data set and I trained this model and like, look how it works and how it reacts to sound and all this other stuff. Totally up to you, and also totally up to like how much time you have. So I would say like, you know, there's no real homework expectation, like no one's getting a grade out of this class, but I will say to probably expect around 2 to 6 hours of homework every week. That varies. Like this week will probably be pretty short, but as you get to like week 3, which I think is when we talk about data sets, like making and training a data set is a pretty intensive process. So that could take you a couple hours. So just sort of know that like, depending on what you want to do and depending on how much time you have, like there may be some more intense weeks than others. So obviously like everyone has their own schedule here. It sounds like many of you are working professionals. So I'm aware that like, you know, in the middle of everything right now, like who knows what sort of time you actually have available to work on this stuff. So there's a couple approaches here you can take. One is like do every homework assignment to the T. You know, I think you'll learn the most that way, but of course, like that is a decent amount of time every week to get there. Another option is just to follow along, but also sort of like plan ahead of like what do you want to make as like sort of a big project at the end of class. And then, you know, I've had many people who have just sort of hung out in class, sat in, asked questions, and like never really shared any of their work with me, which is totally fine. Again, I think you'll learn more by actually like doing stuff, but everyone has their own way of working. So you're more than welcome. Like, again, I'm not gonna like check in on you and be like, hey, did you make anything this week? At least on an individual level. So I will ask the group as a whole, but like no one has to be like, you know, feel like they have to make stuff every week. So I mentioned you'll get videos for this class. You will also, there's already links to the slides for this class. Notes are so-so. Sometimes what'll happen is in a Q&A, like someone will ask me questions and I'll follow up with answers like outside of this and I'll add those notes to the class site. That way it's like people will have that stuff, but there aren't always notes and sometimes it just depends on what sort of questions people ask. If you're interested, we're gonna take a look at the class site now. So this is the class URL. It's posted in our Slack channel. There are already links to today's slides. As soon as the class is over with, I'll get a video and I'll upload that to YouTube. So usually by like the end of day tonight, you'll have a link to the video here. Clearly the formatting broke on this homework slide, so I'll fix that. But your homework will be listed here as well as listed at the end of the slides. And then let's talk for a minute just about Slack. So as you know, there's a Slack channel just for us. It's a private channel, so you can feel free to ask whatever questions you want there. This is just SSHH August 2020. If you're not in there already, which I think most everyone is, but if you forever aren't there, let me know and we can get you in there. This particular Slack channel is just sort of like one that I've used for all of my classes. People from YouTube who like my videos tend to come in and ask questions too. So it's not the most active Slack channel. I'd say we get a couple messages a week or, you know, a couple a day. But you're more than welcome to hang out and check out other sections as well. Maybe two places I would recommend checking things out are just an inspiration. So you might see like some cool projects there. People tend to post, you know, fairly infrequently, but some interesting things. And then the share work channel or share projects channel, which is again where people sort of share things they've made throughout the weeks or whatever. So I'll definitely recommend that, like, if you make something you're really proud of in our class, like share it there as well. People will often ask, oh, how'd you make that? Or what were you using? That sort of thing. So those are probably the two channels I would definitely recommend checking out just as a part of this class. But there are a number of other channels. There's one specifically tied to Runway, which is mostly just when an announcement of like a new feature or something comes out, someone will post in there. Maybe sometimes people have questions about, you know, different Runway things, but that's about it. Yeah, so there's a ton of other channels in here. Some of them get more activity than others, but you're more than welcome to just dig around and sort of see what's there. All right. So just to tell you a little bit about myself, you know, with SSHH, I never know, like, if people checked out my work before, like that sort of thing, or are they just like coming in fresh? So I'll tell you a little bit about my work. So I work primarily as a UX designer right now. I work at MailChimp, which is why all the Zoom links have MailChimp in them. I was at the New York Times prior to that for about 3.5 years. So mostly working in product design, UX design. And this work is sort of a hobby that I have outside of my day job. So I've sort of been teaching these classes for over a year now. I started the first one was in July of last year. So been working a lot with SSHH. And I now teach usually one course every quarter with them, in addition to teaching some other classes that are sold through my site. About 2 years ago, maybe a little bit longer than 2 years ago now, I took a class sort of not that dissimilar from this class with SFPC, which is the School for Poetic Computation. If you're in New York, you might be aware of these folks because they have a lot of ties to like ITP and the digital, like sort of the design and art community and art and tech community, that sort of thing. I took a class with many of these folks. If you're not familiar with their names, I recommend looking them up because all of them are artists working with machine learning in different ways. Zach is one of the founders of SFPC, and lots of people probably know his work from the internet. He mostly does machine learning by using like pose detection. So he does a lot with like dancing and then takes that into his own work. Gene Kogan is like probably one of the more well-known machine learning for artists folks. He has a website called Machine Learning for Artists where he's slowed down a little bit, but he used to post a lot of materials for a number of years there through classes that he taught. Allison Parrish is an amazing text artist. You know, Chris actually, at the time when I met him, was an ITP grad student, and he is now the founder of Runway. So, or one of the founders of Runway. So you can sort of see just in 2 or 3 years, like he's now building his own company that uses that and basically making tools for artists using machine learning. This was work that I did when I first started out of that program. And it looks kind of funny now because it's slightly older. Machine learning like moves so quickly that you get very like dependent. You can almost tell what year things were produced just by like looking at how they artifact and those sort of things. But this is sort of on the left is a thing called DC-GAN, which is the predecessor to something like StyleGAN, if you're familiar with that. And on the right is a style transfer, which is fine. It's like people still do style transfer today, but I would say that I've learned how to drastically improve that image. So kind of funny to look at it now. This is some of my current work. So on the left is a style transfer of me, and you can just sort of see like the textures are better. There's a bunch of other things. On the right is a StyleGAN plus style transfer image that is then duotoned and done through a risograph. These are this one on the left now is a thing called CycleGAN, which allows you to translate 2 images from each other. We'll talk a little bit more about all these as we go through class, but yeah, that's one of the things you can do. This is an image I made for Baffler magazine. So I've started to do more like illustration commissions and things through this as well. And then this is a video that uses StyleGAN, and then it's also audio reactive. So I think we'll look at some stuff like this in class, maybe the last week of class. I'll sort of show you how to use P5, which is a programming language for artists, to do some audio capture, and then how to manipulate StyleGAN using that detail. So that'll probably be like the most advanced thing we get to in this class, but that'll still be pretty cool. All right, so let me check to see what time we're at here. Cool, all right, we're just in time. So I'm gonna start by just sort of like, I wanna just jump in and start making some stuff in Runway. So what I would love for you to do while I get set up is I would love for everyone to think of a sentence. Just think of a sentence, and if you can add that sentence to chat, I will pick a couple and we'll make some images using them. So I'm gonna get set up and just move over to Runway. So when you've thought of a sentence, just pop it into our chat window here. All right, so we're gonna use this model called attention GAN. I'm just gonna jump in Runway, and like I know that this might be a little confusing, but we'll just look at what we're producing, and then we'll come back after our break and talk about like what Runway is and how to use it. So I'm gonna get this kicked off here, and I'm gonna just grab one of these sentences when we're set up. So okay, so I'm just gonna start from the top. I'm gonna start with Claudio's, my dog's farts smell bad. All right, so there's our image. And then we're gonna take Darian's, the jasmine tea is divine. All right, Reed's is going on a late night walk. And Michael's is doors are for the body, windows are for the mind. I'm excited to see what this one looks like. John has, I lost my wallet in the park last night. Oops. Ben, Gremlins 2 is a masterpiece. Grace, I like a shoe-free home. It's really funny because this one looks fairly similar to the Jasmine Tea is Divine, but those are two very different sentences. And then lastly, Anthony's is I just finished dinner. Cool, okay. So now we've seen all of your images. So now I'm gonna go ahead and produce a couple sentences myself. And I'm gonna use, I parked my car at the beach. My dog played fetch at the park.
Does it update the image with each word that you're adding?
It does a little bit, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But yeah, so we could also just say, my dog fetched the ball. There we go. All right. Okay, so now we've made some images. I'm interested to hear from folks. What did you think about that experience, or like, what were your takeaways from that?
I found it pretty unique that it changes for like every word that you add, or like kind of like subtract. So it automatically adapts to like everything added to that, which is pretty like exciting. Would an image change by just adding like a punctuation type of mark, like a period or like an exclamation mark?
Yeah, let's try it. Hold on, let me just rerun this and let's see. Yeah, so it seems to.
Oh.
Yeah. So yeah, so you're sort of seeing it changes per word. It even changes like as if you type stuff out really slowly, it does sort of change per letter even. Yeah. What do other folks think?
I thought it was interesting that the late night stroll one was like very moody and like fit that. Surprising.
Yeah, it was able to pick up things like night, right? So like if we do night, you get an image that looks like that. If you do daytime, you get an image like that.
I kind of like immediately, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just wondering where is it pulling like these images from?
I'll get to that in just a minute. Reed, what did you think?
That was pretty much what I was going to bring up. It just makes me curious, like what the data set is and like how it's trained and if it works in other languages, or yeah, it's just interesting to think like where the data is coming from.
Yeah, totally.
I have a quick question. So like, let's say I put daytime on mine. Is it going to have this exact same image, or is it always?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't actually know. So let's try this. Let's just remove time, and we get a different image, and we put time back. I do think it is like, if you put in the exact same phrase, I think it'll be the same. What did people think about the quality or like the visual output?
It really gives sort of like a dream-like impression. Like if you were to try to visually remember what a dream looked like, it's when you go back, it's kind of fuzzy and not as vivid as you thought it was when you experienced it.
Did anyone notice any particular phrases or sentences that worked and others that didn't, or like weren't as real as other images?
Some of the dog ones seemed like they worked really well.
Yeah. So I think describing them as dreamlike is a very nice way of saying they suck. Like these are not, like if the idea is like, I want to see an image that is a dog in a park, like that is not a dog in a park, right? That is like dog fur abstractly in grass, right? And I think like this, so I love this as an intro demo because it touches on a couple things. One is like lower your expectations of what a machine learning model can actually do, especially on images, because a lot of these will produce very funky things. So like, you know, there's so much going on in the world today where it's like, oh, machine learning is going to change the world and it's going to like do all these things in 2 years. And it's like, this is an example of like maybe it's a year old now or a 2-year-old, but like this was an example of a state-of-the-art like machine learning model, and you can sort of see how well it works. So two, I think to Reed and Ben's questions, which are like, what is this trained on? So part of the reason why the dog works well is that a lot of models are trained on images of dogs or animals or other things. So my hope was that like, I love that some of these were really abstract, like sort of sentences, right? And you sort of could not get a real, like realistic representation of an image. Whereas, you know, so this is a model called Attention GAN. I'm not sure exactly what the image data set is. It's probably some like ImageNet, which we'll talk about models and that sort of thing next week. But it's basically sort of the reverse, which is what they do is they train it on, they give you, they come with a bunch of images and then they have someone, usually a intern or a data science assistant, has to write sentences for those things. So usually train in the inverse and then you do the opposite to get actually the data set, or like to produce and test this thing. So they found images, they wrote captions for them, and then they train it. And then on the reverse side, you get a sentence and you get an image out. So knowing what the data set was trained on matters a lot, because if it's never seen a gremlin, it's certainly not going to know how to produce a gremlin. If it's never seen a wallet, it's not going to know how to produce a wallet. But if it does know about a night or nighttime, like it can work with those. So this is something that we'll see pretty commonly in Runway, is that you kind of have to figure out what this thing was trained on in order to understand how it works. And the data sets, which we will talk about a lot more over the next couple weeks, what data set you have available to you or that you're using matters a lot, and it changes the outputs of things. So I think this is just a great example of like, if you were just come in here blind and be like, this is gonna produce a sentence, and you wanna type in, you know, a certain sentence and then you get something out and you're like, this sucks, what happened here? You sort of have to begin to unpack that. So especially for the first couple weeks, like what we're gonna do is we're just gonna look at some models and sort of unpack how it might be working, how it is working, how do I find out how it's supposed to work, that sort of thing. So thanks for playing along with me. I'll share a bunch of these images in our Slack channel after class, but it's always fun to sort of just start and see where this thing goes. Okay. Any other questions or any other thoughts about Attention GAN?
How detailed are the sentences, or is that something you just have to figure out while you're playing around?
Yeah, so you can actually type this in Attention GAN, and you can look at some of these. So we'll talk about how this works as well in the near future. But I think what they'll show you, if you dig around in here, is they'll sort of show you the examples that they use. So this is the bird is red with white and a very short beak. So, you know, again, most of these descriptions are like captions for photos. So they're very prescriptive about what you see. So things that are abstract, like, you know, the bird is angry. It doesn't really know how to do an angry bird. Whereas also like you can look at like a photo of homemade swirly pasta with broccoli and carrots. Yeah, again, it's like very descriptive. So the way this data set is trained is it's trained to be super descriptive about the images it sees. So you should probably like build that in mind. So the question is like, could you say the brown dog or the white dog or the, you know, fluffy dog? That's almost like things you could play with inside this model to actually see like, how receptive is it to these types of words?
Cool.
One other question about this one is, oh, sorry, did you have something, Grace?
No, go ahead.
I'm curious about like the output, if there's a way to like control the size or like clarity of the output at all.
Yeah, so we'll talk about that more too. In this particular example in Runway, you don't. In this particular example, they only are output as 256 by 256. So resolution, as we start to look at things in Runway, it becomes pretty important to know what your outputs are. There are ways to mess with this a little bit, but Runway is pretty specific, and different models will have different output sizes. And some models will have like very strict output sizes, and others will be more flexible. So yeah, there's another thing that, like, if you just jump in Runway, you're like, cool, I'm gonna make a high res print of this image. And you're like, oh, it's 300 pixels by 300 pixels. How do I do this? So yeah, definitely something to be aware of, that each of these generally has an output size that it's usually fixed to. Cool. I like that this class is very, sometimes I don't get any questions and I'm always just sort of like, okay, I'll keep teaching. So really happy to like keep throwing me questions. All right, so we'll start with just a little bit of machine learning 101. Again, this isn't really like going deep into technical detail, but just sort of give you a high level overview of things. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of talk about machine learning, AI, all this sort of stuff. And I think like the mainstream press, or even, well, especially the tech press, like sort of has this vision of this, right? Which is like robots are going to take over the world. Look already that like this robot can make images from text. And it's sort of like makes the idea that there's this supercomputer that is going to be here in the near future that will change everything. If you hear people talk about this way, or you might hear people talk about like something like AGI or general AI. So this is a concept of just like robots, supercomputers, things that know everything, that sort of thing. And the truth is, outside of a couple whack jobs out there like Elon Musk or other folks, like most real machine learning scientists don't believe it's ever going to happen. Or like the way it happens is like having a bunch of these little, like what we call narrow AI, built up into like a thing that can think about a lot of stuff together. But realistically, we don't expect like robots or like, Terminators to exist anytime in the near future. So you'll hear a lot of people talk about like, oh, AI is here and it's going to change the world. And like, it probably will, but it will change it in a much more subtle and like confusing way than it will be like, now we have robot overlords. So as I alluded to, what we're going to be working with mostly in this class is what we call narrow AI. I would define narrow AI as code or like some sort of implementation that does one thing well. The really is in here as like it's meant to do one thing really well, and oftentimes it just does one thing okay. But the important thing here is that it's usually trained to do one thing, right? So attention GAN is trained to convert text to images, and often to convert text of photorealistic things into images. So like as you begin to narrow these tasks down, you can say like, okay, like in that paper I was just, or the GitHub repo I was showing, it did a good job with those birds, right? So there's like a bird model that can produce birds from text. And it did a fairly decent job with that. So like that is where the narrower your implementation is, the more likely you are to be able to do a good thing with it. But this is going to become really important as we think about Runway, and I think about the tasks that are available in Runway, is that like understanding what the one thing it's supposed to do well is going to give you a heads up and like and sort of like, I can either lean into that and make it do that one thing well, or I can like figure out how to break it and make something really weird out of it. This is an example of horse to zebra. So the idea here is that it does one thing fairly well. It converts a horse to a zebra, right? So it's able to take a horse and it's able to put stripes on it. This is now a 3-year-old model. We have much better versions of this now, but you'll even see like in the posts as it walks by, whoops, it adds some stripes to the post, right? So like this isn't the perfect model, but if you were to watch this on YouTube at a really small resolution, you might be able to believe that that was really a horse or really a zebra. So we'll talk a little bit about just what the ML process is. So I know some folks have already brought up data sets. We'll talk a little bit more about training and testing. But essentially, machine learning is broken down in a couple like process steps. And this is the way that all machine learning models work. If it doesn't work like this, it's probably not machine learning. But essentially, you start with a thing called a data set. And all of us have heard about big data or about how Facebook is using our data, that sort of thing. So we all sort of think about like data is human, and that is true. Like humans collect data, so therefore it has inherent biases and inherent human qualities in them. And a lot of people tend to think about like, what about my Facebook data? Is Facebook able to recreate me based on the data but just about me? And the truth is no. What Facebook or other companies do is they like connect all of your data. So all of Grace's data, all of Reed's data, all of John's data. And then they're able to sort of say like, what is a meta-human, or like, how do I combine like a human using everyone's age or like, you know, photo. So maybe it's somewhere where like Facebook wants to guess how old you are by a photo of you, right? So they need like thousands upon thousands of people who list their face and their age so that you can do that work. So there's like, it's sort of, and this is where data sets get confusing, is because, you know, you could say, well, I want my data out of that, so they can't use my data anymore. The problem is if they still have 10,000 other people's data, they can still make inferences about you, right? So there's really like, there's a problem here where like, even you opting out of the system makes it a challenge. And so data, as you'll hear about, people talk about big data. Big data is like, we need massive amounts of data in order to make inferences around things. In this class, we'll be looking at mostly pictures as data. So that means 10,000 pictures of horses, 10,000 pictures of zebras, maybe 100 pictures of horses, maybe 100 pictures of zebras. So data sets also, it's about how many photos of something do you have, or how many images of something do you have? How closely are they aligned to each other? We'll talk about that a lot more when we get into training. But yeah, just think about like data is more or less about how many thousands of things do you have, and not just about what little pieces of information do you know about something. So in most cases where the models we're going to play with, how they're trained, is you take all these stacks upon stacks of photos and you run them through what I would refer to as a network. You might also hear people refer to it as a model. This is a specific like coded architecture that tells the machine how to break apart all of these images into individual, what we call features. That usually starts by just breaking them down into pixels, and then being able to add pixels together to make structures. But this basically goes through a network. And then what the network is supposed to do is it's supposed to take the input, and it has a specific output, right? So in the case of the horse to zebras model, the idea is it would take a set of horses and a set of zebras and learn how similar they can be and combine them. So then you can do zebras to horses or horses to zebras. But the output is also predefined in most of these models. So out of this training comes what I would refer to as a model. So you'll often hear people refer to models in both of these steps. In the case of Runway, it's helpful to think about models as what exactly am I doing? What has the model been trained on? So it's horse to zebras. So there is a network called CycleGAN that does this thing. CycleGAN is what I would call the network or the architecture. And then the model is horse to zebras, or faces to flowers, or you know, any number of translatable materials. Again, people will generally muddle these two terms together. So when someone's talking about it, you might have to ask them like for a little more clarity about what they're talking about. So that's training. The training process can take anywhere from hours to days to months. So in the case of StyleGAN, which we'll look at, Runway has a way for you to train in a couple hours, so in like 8 hours. But that's because of other folks who have trained for months. So we'll talk about that more in the future, but know that some of this stuff can take a while. And Runway supports training, but only of a certain model, a certain couple models. There's like 3 or 4 models that they currently support. Or networks, sorry. I should keep my terminology separated too. So they have networks that are available that you can train on, but there's only a handful of them. Whereas Runway is really known as a place to do testing, or you might refer to as inference, or what I think we would think about it as, which is like the creation step. How do we generate new images from it? The testing step is you take whatever your input is. So in the case of attention GAN, it was a sentence or text or letters. In some cases, it's something like math. It's like a number or it's a position. Sometimes it's a single image. Sometimes it's 2 images. So again, inputs sort of matter. You should know what your model is meant to take as an input. This then gets fed to the model. And what gets spit out is, in many cases for us, will be an image. But there are some models that take in an image and spit out a caption or a piece of text. So this is what like Runway's bread and butter is. Runway is mostly set up to do this, which is that here's a model I found in Runway. The input is a piece of text and the output is an image, or the input is an image and the output is an image that looks really weird or does something different. So Runway was started by, I mentioned Chris and one of his co-founders probably about 2 years ago now. It was right around when he left ITP. they founded Runway. Runway is like one of the better sort of tools that I've found to sort of, what I like about it is it does a lot of different things. It supports a lot of different models. And in fact, I've added some of my own models to it that we can play with. But what I like about it is it eliminates sort of a lot of other versions still require some sort of code or text interface. What Runway has done a good job is they found a way to sort of generalize the GUI, the interface for it. So you can sort of play with a bunch of different models using a similar interface. Now you still need to know a lot of the details of how that interface works, but it does eliminate some of the code and the setup and other things that would honestly make this class a 10-week class if I had to go through all those steps. So Runway will be a nice way for us to learn about these models and play with them and sort of infer certain things from them. But it may not be the last place where you stop. So, Runway is known as sort of like a Photoshop for machine learning. There is no code interface, like there's no way to access the code side of this using Runway itself. Now there are other ways to access it using sort of other tools, but we'll mostly be using Runway plus something else in order to do some coding. As I mentioned, it removes a lot of hurdles. It really does. Oftentimes I even pop open Runway still these days just to play with stuff and just sort of see how it works, because setup for other things without Runway are pretty hefty. Runway's also done a lot of good stuff in the past couple of months to make the interface improve functionality. So we'll look at some tools that Runway's added that honestly are better than anything I could produce by myself. So again, it really is that Photoshop level where like, yeah, you could do all these things in a pixel by pixel level, but Photoshop has eliminated and made a lot of the tooling easy for those things. So we'll look a lot at some of those tools in the next couple weeks. If you take anything away from this class, I hope it's this, which is, again, Alison Parrish, who's like an amazing text artist, who does a lot of writing using machine learning and that sort of thing. I love this quote from her, which is like, asking, can a computer generate Shakespeare, to me is less interesting than asking, what would Gertrude Stein have made with TensorFlow? For those of you that don't know, TensorFlow is a machine learning model language. Gertrude Stein happened to be a writer who was like very into formal play and changing things. So again, my approach to this is like, this class is not about like, I want a machine learning model to basically take over my job. I want to be eliminated from the workforce by an artist that can now make things. And more like, how do I, as an individual artist or as a designer, leverage these tools to either do my work quicker, to make more interesting things, to really begin to like explore new areas. So it's really like, this is, I think sometimes people think about machine learning models like man versus machine. And I think of this as like man plus machine, right? So it's like, how do we work together with these things to make new stuff? So that's sort of what we're really gonna focus on in this class. As I mentioned before, like Runway is really set up to mostly focus on testing. They're doing a lot more work to really build out their training interfaces and things. But I'd still say just because of the nature of training, like Runway is not the best place to be doing training. So it's really about testing. So what's nice is that there's probably something like 100 different models inside of Runway. And there's usually a new one every couple of weeks or whatever, like either they're adding to it or the community's adding to it. So there's lots of opportunities to explore different things. They add training very slowly. They just recently added another training method. And I think that means they're up to 3 different training methods. So it's pretty low how often you'll get a new training method within Runway. And data sets, we'll talk about this more, I think not next week or the week after. They do have some tools to help generate data sets, but it's very, very small. And we'll look at some other tools that I've made to help generate data sets. We'll definitely look at that in the next couple weeks, because one of the things we'll hopefully get out of this is that we can train our own model using images that we find or use. So here we talk about pre-trained models, and what a pre-trained model is basically like someone has already done the training for us, which means we can utilize that testing step, which is like input, output, that sort of thing. So there are a bunch of pre-trained models. When I talk about 100 different models, they're all pre-trained, meaning there's an example we can already use today. It does not include every model, so oftentimes you might see someone post something on the internet that is like, look at this cool new machine learning model that does this thing, and you might try to find it in Runway and it probably doesn't exist. There's many reasons for why that might be. One of them is just like, there are new machine learning models pretty much every day, and the time to put them all into Runway, it would be pretty astronomical. And then Runway also doesn't support certain things. So they don't support any audio outputs. So that makes like, you can't really generate music using Runway. They don't really support video outputs either, although there's one way to get some video out of it. But that just is the limit of sort of how Runway works. They may add those features later, but at the moment they don't support video output in a clear fashion beyond like an interpolation video. There's limited training usage, and quite honestly, I'll say Runway is expensive to use. Now, for those of you who don't have access to a crazy GPU server or don't know how to set up something like Colab or Paperspace, it's probably the best experience available to you, but it is fairly expensive. Just be aware of that. So this class comes with $100 in credits. That should be totally enough for this class. But should you want to keep using Runway, you know, that price might go up as you decide to use it more and more. So pricing for Runway, so it's 5 cents per minute for testing. So when I was doing that attention GAN test where I was just sort of like running text in it, GAN image, it was costing me 5 cents per minute to do that, which is fine. I mean, I probably spent what, 5 minutes there, so it wasn't that expensive. It was a quarter, not the end of the world. But if you want to do that for an hour, that gets fairly more expensive. And the longer you do that, the more expensive it gets. For training, training is a little different. Training is set up so that it is half a cent per step. And we'll talk about what a step is when we get to training. But essentially this means that it is like a average training for something like StyleGAN will probably cost you around $30. And obviously if you were to do that over and over and over again, that would get really, really expensive. One thing to note is, I think, so I'll reach out to everybody after class just to make sure that you've set up an account on Runway. Chris has, who I know, has been kind enough to grant us all a creator subscription, which means we can do training without you having to sign up for a subscription. But I think after this month, it'll like sort of turn off. So if you want to do your own training after this, you will have to have what they call the creator plan, which is $15 a month or $140 a year. That is on top of the cost of training itself. So if you want to do one training and you weren't in this class, it would probably cost you about $45 in total. You need to sign up for a plan, you then need to pay them credits, and then you do the training, and then you'd be done. So just be aware of this. This can get kind of expensive. There are businesses, this is how they stay afloat. One thing I will note is that with the creator plan, you do get discounts on your credits going forward. So it's sort of like the MTA card where like you put $20 on it and it gives you like $22 in credits. So we'll talk more about pricing over the next couple weeks because I think it's gonna be something that everyone's gonna be aware of and want to keep top of mind. But yeah, so Runway is not cheap in terms of how this stuff works. And to be honest, it's like there are cheaper ways out there, but they're much harder in terms of like just getting down to the experience. So this is like a balance for me of just like, I want people to be able to make stuff as quickly as possible without having to get set up. But there are some costs involved. Let's take a look at time here. Cool, so why don't we take a break here? Let's take like a 5-minute break and then we'll come back and I'll just walk through how Runway actually works. Yeah, so let's do that. So why don't, actually let's do 8, let's do 7 minutes. So let's come back. If you're on the East Coast, it's 8:08. If you're on whatever other place, it's 8 after. So let's just do 7 or 8 minutes and then we'll come back and we'll pick up from here. Cool? Just see everybody in a couple minutes. Before I move on to a walkthrough of Runway, any questions about what we've covered so far?
I just had a question. You mentioned that you don't do most of your work in Runway. I'm just curious, like how you're producing your work outside of Runway.
Yeah, so there's 2 different ways to sort of do this. There's a thing called Colab, which is basically like being able to run what are called notebooks inside of a web browser. Colab is a Google product, and basically it syncs up to one of their servers. The thing about machine learning is that you need really high-powered GPUs to do a lot of image-based work. So if you're like a 3D artist and you have a GPU that you render to, usually you can use that same GPU for machine learning. I also have just bought like a bunch of GPUs myself. So I sort of have like a little server farm now that I work off of. In general, I would say like most people shouldn't jump that far unless you're doing this day in, day out for the next 6 months. Because the cost of these GPUs are pretty high. Like they usually start around $1,500. And that's not including the rest of the computer. So it can get pretty pricey. So in that case, like Runway is actually fairly affordable. So you don't have to buy that GPU, but you do have to like invest or spend in other places. Yeah, so I mostly use a mix of my own stuff and then collab to do some things. Yeah. Any other questions? Cool. All right, well, I'll share my screen and then we'll jump into walking through Runway. So as usually happens to me, Runway updated their entire interface like a week or two ago. So I've got a bunch of demo videos of like other like models that we'll talk about toward the end of class. One thing to note is that those will be in the old UI and there was a new UI. So I don't think it'll be that different, but if you do get confused, like just reach out to me and we can sort of talk through that thing. The other news that Runway put out recently is that they now have a web app. So I think for this attention GAN demo, I did it in the web app. The web app is at app.runwayml.com. I hope everyone's made accounts. If you haven't, I definitely recommend that be on your to-do list this week. Set that up and make sure that you use the credits you've been given for class. I'll post a note about that in Slack just to make sure everyone is aware of it. So app.runway.com will be the web app. They also have a downloadable app for Windows and Mac. I don't really have a preference anymore because it's pretty much the exact same interface. I will say that I generally use the desktop app just because I lose everything in my browser tabs. So in that case, sometimes it's easier to use the downloadable app. It's sort of up to you. They are now essentially the exact same interface, so it won't really matter either way. Just depends on how you like to work. So I'll probably go through the web interface for most of this class just because I assume that's probably how most people will be using it. But if not, the web app or the desktop app will be basically the same thing. Cool, so as I mentioned, when you first start up the app, I think it'll take you to, let's just see. Yeah, so it takes you to a page that looks like this. This is your home page. So the most important thing to look through is the thing on the left here. So you've got a thing called workspaces. We'll talk a little bit more about workspaces when we actually get into demoing. Workspaces are basically like your file or whatever you're working in immediately at that moment. The reason that workspaces exist is that you can actually do a thing we'll look at next week, which is called chaining, which means you can put multiple machine learning models in one workspace and then you can tie them together. So we'll look at how to do that more next week. But that's why workspaces exist. Workspaces are basically the way where you actually are running your model and doing your image generation from. Runway recently added this thing called quick actions, which is just like a bunch of sort of workflow tools. So if you're doing a particular task, a lot of these tools will sort of help you do that work. So they have a lot of background removal tools, which are like a machine learning model where it tries to figure out the edges. If you used any of the Photoshop tools recently where it's like select the subject, it's a similar tool to that where it can basically like sort of figure out what the subject of an image is and then it can help you remove the background. Super resolution, so we'll look at some super resolution stuff when we do chaining. Super resolution is like a model that gets you slightly better than just up-resing the image in Photoshop. It uses machine learning to actually sort of produce new pixels as it up-reses to varying degrees of quality. I would say there, again, if you lower your expectations of machine learning models, super resolution is pretty nice, but it's not perfect. And actually I saw just yesterday, the day before, there was like some big hullabaloo over a company that just produces super resolution apps that like someone like kept seeing faces in their model. And it turned out that it was because there's a face setting in the app to help produce better faces using super resolution. And if you keep that on while generating abstract images, it'll find faces where they don't really exist. So again, this is sort of like the fun of machine learning is sometimes they find things that you think shouldn't exist there, but you've told it to find faces and it does. Estimating depth, so if you're into 3D work, this is actually a really helpful model to get depth estimation out of images. And then colorizing images. I don't really know why this is here in workflow, but it's a cool model if anyone wants to play with it. There's a company called Dealdify that now has released like a full app that does a really good job of converting black and white images to color. Assets are where all your data sets will go. So if you're producing custom or your own personal data sets, this is where your data sets will go. If you're using pre-trained models that already have built-in data sets, those will just exist in the model. So this is just sort of like your assets. In addition to your data sets, it will also include like outputs when you export stuff. So we'll look at exports probably maybe toward the end of this. But yeah, so like we'll look at how to export out like batches of images. Those batches of images will show up in your assets. So assets are basically anything that's just yours, either inputs or outputs. And lastly, before I jump to models, let me show you some other things. So if you click here on the ellipses menu up here, you'll get the account, manage subscription, buy credits, and log out. You don't really need to log out, but in case you do, if you want to buy credits, this is the way to buy credits. You just select the buy credits thing. You probably have to give it your credit card when you set up an account, I think, maybe not, I don't know. And you can set values here. Because I do have a creator plan, I get a bonus for every credit that I like add to this. So if I add $20 in credits, I get a $5 bonus. For those of you who had, well, everyone here has a coupon code to use. If you go to manage subscription, and then you come to credits here, and then at the bottom here is a coupon code. So the coupon code I mailed to everyone. I'll drop it in Slack again after class in case you didn't get to use it. Just put your coupon code in here and hit redeem credits, and you will get your $100 in credits for the class. So just beware that that is where you want to do it. If you just started an account, I think they give you $20 in credits to start with too. So if you're brand new to Runway, $120 will get you a pretty far way in Runway for this class. So that covers some of the account stuff. You want to change like your username or your password, whatever you do that account. There's a chat window here, so if you want to like talk to support, you can do that. They're pretty responsive. I mostly use their Slack channel, which I'll also link to. Runway has their own Slack channel where they post a lot of stuff and have a lot of people responding to them. So if you need yet another Slack channel, I can send you the link to that one. It's open to anyone. And then there's a question mark here for where there are some video tutorials for Runway. I think Gene Kogan does a lot of them. So if you're interested in that, you can check that out. Oh, there's a link to Slack channel here. Cool. So you can click this and just go to the Slack channel immediately. There are some FAQs, other things. I have a list of my own video tutorials that I'll link you to as well. They cover different things, so you can probably get the best of both by watching both of them. And lastly, here are the models. So this is where we're going to spend most of our time, at least for the next couple of days or next couple of weeks, are in models. So when you click on models, you'll see that you have a whole list of models down below here. And the challenge here is that there are a ton of models, and you won't know how to use any of them or like what they mean or what they are. So actually your homework for the next week is just sort of like dig in and try to find some cool models. I'll give you some tips about how to do this, which is like, it starts by sorted by trending. I don't recommend using that because it's just going to be like, what are people using right now? And I find that pretty difficult to work with. What I recommend is going through these category filters here. So within categories, there are different categories for each of these models. So depending on the category, this is what you're maybe going to like want to play with and sort of find the most interesting things in. The community one will be all Runway community generated StyleGAN models or GPT-2 models. So StyleGAN is an image generation model. It's the one that we'll be doing training with in the next couple weeks. GPT-2 is a text model. You might have heard the internet is blown up because of GPT-3. GPT-2 was the prior version of that and is trainable within Runway. So if you're interested in doing text or prose generation or poem generation, you can find some pre-existing models there. Image synthesis as a category is anything that can generate images. So our attention GAN model, which was here, is still here. So this would be text to image. So the image is being generated from it. Motion capture. So this is for folks who want to do maybe some stuff like what Gene Kogan does, where you're capturing body shapes or body poses. This is where you can upload a video and it could give you out all the frames of that video with the pose tracking. I don't cover a lot of this because it just doesn't cover my own work, but if you are interested in this, let me know, and I can probably find some tutorials on how to use these if you're interested. Text-based, so this is anything that's going to either generate, actually, oh, interesting. They split out the community from StyleGAN to text. So there's also GPT text is here in text-based, but there's also some other things in here like detecting text in photos, character generation. This is kind of a catch-all for all sorts of interesting things. And we'll look at this im to text, which is a caption generator. We'll look at that when we do some chaining and feedback loops. Recognition is going to be sort of object detection. So there's a number of object detection models in here. So detecting faces, detecting, body shapes or objects. Again, this one is like maybe not artistic in and of itself, but maybe you train it with something else that could do some generation with that. Post-processing is a lot of workflow tools. So here will be deoldify. Here will be like editing images like that you already have. Super resolution, so a couple of these are super resolution networks, or denoising photos. So if you have a really noisy photo, like this is sort of like a tool set for maybe photographers or other folks. Style transfer, we'll talk about style transfer more next week. Style transfer is a very popular way of sort of taking a photo and applying some artistic style to it. There are many, many different versions of style transfer, especially inside of Runway. And deciding which version to use kind of depends on what you want to do with it. So actually Leah, who teaches many of my other classes with me, recorded a really nice demo on YouTube on how to use various style transfer models. So I'll link to that video in case people are interested in that. And lastly, we've got workflow tools. The workflow tools seem to cover the same as post-processing, although they're a little different. So this is kind of the challenge, is that some of the stuff is like in both categories. I'll also say that some models don't show up in any of these categories because they haven't been tagged correctly. So sometimes you do still want to go through sort of the like fire hose and just sort of find different things. So actually a couple of my models, because I uploaded them myself, are not included here. We'll look at a demo of this one in just a little bit. So, you might want to start with those categories, but then just dig around and sort of see what's available to you. Because there are lots of other things in here that might be of interest to you. So actually, I'm just going to come back up here. So let's say you find a model, or like, let's say something looks interesting to you. How do you learn about it? How do you learn how to use it? If you find a model, there's two things to do here. One is to learn more or add directly to your workspace. So in general, if it's your first time with a model, I definitely recommend clicking on the Learn More button. Adding to Workspace will add it directly to Workspace, but then you don't really learn about what's going on with it. So let's click Learn More here. This happens to be a model that I've uploaded and I've trained. So when you go through here, there's a bunch of information here around, what's the description of this thing. So the description of this is, Munit is a multimodal version of an unpaired image translation network. That may not mean anything to you, but we'll discuss what that means in a little bit. The idea here is that the image takes a person's face and then does this sort of flower texturing thing to it. So, that's sort of the idea with this. This is one that I've uploaded and I've trained myself, so I know it fairly well. One thing I think is really, really important and really cool with Runway is that all of these things over here at the very bottom of the page are links to GitHub repos, papers, other features. So if you've never really done a lot of stuff with machine learning, it's important to know that machine learning is a data science sort of field. And a lot of these models are made by research labs. And the way that these research labs get famous or get popular, or just like the individual scientists are well regarded within their field, is they write a paper. So these papers are often, oops, where'd that one go? There we go. So these papers are often on a site called archive.org. They're often a PDF. And they're usually about 20 pages long. And they are really hard to read. But what I would say is, like, you'll see a lot of graphics like this, and you might not know what that means. Or you'll see a lot of mathematical notation. You might not know what that means either. The way I approach these is I sort of like read the paper, I gloss over anything I don't understand, and I try to look at the pictures that they provide. Some of these are really readable, some of these are not. So in this case, looking at this image, I see here there's a bunch of outline. There's an outline of a shoe, and then there's a shoe, and then, so these are comparing this model, which is Munit, to a number of other models that are available. And the idea is that they always show that their version is the best. Like hands down, they always show their version is the best for whatever reason. But the idea that I can sort of infer from here is, okay, I can give it an outline and then get different types of images back from it. So that's cool. Okay, so maybe that's like how this thing works. Oh, here's some more images. Like, go open up a paper and just like look at the images they produce, and you can kind of figure out what they're trying to do. So in this case, it's like I can input a house cat and I can get other cats from it, maybe in the same pose or the same viewpoint or whatever. It looks like I can do the reverse, which is like I can get a tiger or a leopard and I get back cats. This is just sort of like helpful to sort of understand how this goes. So I definitely recommend always trying to give it a shot at reading the paper. Often a lot of it will not make sense to you, and that's fine, but there's usually photos and images in here that can sort of help you. So in this case, it's like, here's a wintry image, and now you can get winter, summer, maybe dusk or whatever. So papers are really helpful just to like sort of get a sense of how the thing is meant to work. Getting used to reading them is also helpful just because you can sort of get a good sense of what works and what doesn't. And then there's a GitHub repo here. So if you are like more of a coding person, you just want to see how the code is built, you can look at it. I would guess that most of you have not written PyTorch or TensorFlow in this class, and those languages are pretty intense. So you might not get a lot out of the code, but if you just want to dig around and look at it, you're welcome to. So once we've decided like I want to play with this model, the next step is to add it to your workspace. So there's two places you can do this from. You can do it back from the actual listing, or you can do it here on this page and go add to workspace. Workspaces are usually given funky names by default, but you can rename them. You can add it to a previously existing workspace. You can add it to a new workspace. I'm going to add this to a new workspace. I'm going to hit create. And now this is the main model interface. This is the interface that like most of us will be playing with day to day. The things to know on the left here are these are our workspaces. So this is a workspace. This is where I was using attention GAN. This is the other workspace where I'm using unit. Because I am in two different workspaces, these models cannot talk to each other. So we'll look at this more next week in chaining, but just know that like if a model is not in the same workspace, it can't be used in conjunction with each other. So we're looking at Munit here now. The next most important thing to know is that you've got your inputs here and your output here. So inputs are always sort of defined. And if you look at the top here, you'll usually see it says image or text or vector, and we'll talk about vectors next week. But you'll basically just see that there is like an input type here. Sometimes there will be two input types in case of like you can use two different images. So just be aware that like sometimes this space will be divided. When you have an input, you can choose camera, you can choose a file. That is choosable up here as well as also in this dropdown. So in this case, I'm going to choose file. And this just means that now I can upload a file. It will tell you what file types it supports, but just so you're aware, like usually if it's an image file, you can upload most image types. Your output will be down here. And then on the right-hand side here, this will change model to model, but these are usually your settings you're able to play with within each model. So in this case, there's almost always a checkpoint, and a checkpoint is the model, what it's actually translating to. In this case, there's only one. Sometimes there might be other models here, in the case of other models, where it's like, this one can convert from faces to flowers. The other one can convert from horse to zebras, or from winter to night, to winter to summer, like those sort of things. So one thing to know is that usually anything at the top here has to be set before you start the machine. So you have to set your checkpoint before you start a machine. Other things that are under inference options can be changed on the fly while your machine is running. So I'm talking about a machine. What do I mean by that? So what Runway does is when you hit run model, it'll start charging you for your 5 cents per minute. What it does is behind the scenes, it spins up a server, one of these fancy GPU servers, and then it's able, once it's set up and running, it's able to actually do the conversion you want to do. So I'm going to go ahead and click run model. This can take anywhere from 30 seconds to a couple minutes. So you just don't really know. The key here is that if it says stop, that means it's ready to go. When you hit stop, your machine will stop. It will turn that server off and it will stop charging you. So just be aware of like that, making sure your model is running versus stopping. There is like an auto stop where I think if it isn't running after, if it's not getting new information or receiving new information from Runway over a couple minutes, it'll just turn itself off. So you'll see here that when I turn this on, this became grayed out, so I can't edit this anymore. So if there were more options here, I'd have to stop the machine, change my checkpoint, and then restart it. So this particular model takes in photos of people and it converts them to like flowery looking people. So what we're going to do is we're just going to grab a couple images from our either we can grab them from in here, or I'm actually gonna upload my own. So this is all of my asset library. So because I don't have any faces in here, I'm gonna upload some new faces. So let's just upload some files. I'm gonna go over to my desktop. I just downloaded a couple while we were here. So I'm gonna upload this one. So these will just upload almost directly, and like they upload pretty quickly because they're on the web. And here you go. So now we've taken this image and we've output these flower images. So a couple things to know here. One, this didn't work as well as some of the examples that I showed, right? Why is that? Hard to say. And maybe that the model that I was showing, the model I trained on didn't have photos that use this kind of lighting. You know, it may just be that this particular structure doesn't really work with this model, that sort of thing. It might also just be that in this example, it's just a bad example. There's one thing that's worth tweaking over here. So there's a couple of things to note. One, Munit, I think to read your previous question, Munit doesn't have a size limit, although there is by its nature a size limit because of, because basically like if you upload too large of an image, the GPU will be overrun and it will just like kill, it'll just die. So usually you can get up to like 1500 pixels in the longest dimension and it'll work fine. This one I happen to upload it at 1280 by 720 and it worked fine. If for whatever reason I feel like it's running too slow, I can make it smaller over here in the image options. I can turn this down. And this image will now be output at a smaller size. So it just sort of depends on if you feel like it's running slow or if just like too big of an image. Like sometimes I'll open a 3000 pixel image and I'll just immediately turn it down because I know it's like not gonna work. So there's lots of like, by default, Runway comes with these image options where you can like flip an image left to right. You can do just like some basic manipulations. I don't find that it changes too much, but you can play with it a little bit. Like maybe you wanna look at just making it purely grayscale. And that changes the image a little bit, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of options here to play with. This particular model has a thing called style. And if you hover over style, you'll see that it calls it a style seed. What does that mean? Well, it means it's just like, if I change this number, I'm gonna get a different image. Some models don't work this way. Some models are what we call, I'm totally blanking the name of it right now. Anyway, some models just, if you upload the same image, you always get out the same output, which is I think what we looked at for attention span, right? If you give it the exact same text structure or the exact same string of text, you got the exact same image. With this one, I can change this. If I set this to 10, now I have a different color output. If I change this to 100, I get a different color output. Now the structures themselves are fairly similar, but the colors change a lot. So, you know, sometimes it's also like just playing around, I might find a structure that works better for this face. And sometimes I just won't, which just means maybe the image doesn't particularly work well with this data set. So one thing we can do is we can actually just come in here and we can just replace it with a different image. So let's choose this image. And you'll see here, so this image is 4,200 pixels tall, which means this thing is just straight up not gonna run. It actually looks, yeah, so let's just make this a lot smaller. There we go. So now this image is running better. I bet if we tweak some of the numbers here, let's try 6. So there, that's actually a better image, right? So like you get a little bit more definition in the face, you get a little more definition in the eyes. The colors I think could probably use still tweaking. So maybe I just want to play around here and try to find a different image. That one's pretty cool. That one works really well. Like that purple on the neck and like the eyes are pretty good. The other thing is like this is sort of smushed down. So like if I want to change the size just to focus more on the output, I can do that. So that image is actually pretty cool. Like I really like this one. So again, different inputs might just lead to a better image. Now, one of the things I can tell you is like what I trained this on were images of faces, like almost directly at the camera with pretty clean backgrounds in most cases. So in general, I know a photo like this is probably gonna work better. You know, again, and this is sort of the challenge of like, I know that you might not, like you have to play with this a little bit. So there's just like, you know, so you can, one of the things that's nice about this is you can just play around and just add a bunch of different numbers in here. So what I like about this model is there's a ton of sort of difference, and I can get different results out of it. Which, you know, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. You just have to play around with it a little bit. That's pretty cool too. Yeah, so this is Munit. It's just one of the many models that are available. Let's try a different image and just sort of see how that one works. Yeah, let's try this one. It's like a sort of a nice straightforward image. So this one's a little bit lower resolution, so I think it's going to lead to different results just because of its resolution nature. So let's try to make that back to 0. Yeah, this one might not work as well just because of the resolution. So again, you have to sort of play with these and find out what works and what doesn't. Any questions about Runway or the Runway interface?
Do you have to train do you have to train a model for specific objects, or is there a kind of generic model that will work across objects? Obviously a face is a very specific kind of image, but I was just wondering about more generic objects.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where you get into like sort of the like, let me try it and see. So I actually have done this with other images before. Like let's grab, no, I don't know how this is gonna work. Let's try. I have a data set of cat images. And I think this will work fairly well with those cats. Let's see. Yeah, so, you know, it's just worth trying it and seeing what happens, and trying it with a handful of things and seeing what happens. Like, what's interesting is this image didn't work out that well. The previous one did. And I couldn't really tell you why that is.
Is there a reason your interface options are more limited suddenly?
Give me more information than that. Well, what do you mean by limited?
Oh, for the last image, like the portraits, there were a lot hue and saturation. Like
oh, I think it's because I'm doing like the bulk. This is just like a folder of images, and I think when you use a bulk one, it removes all of the image options. I've actually never noticed that before, but yeah, that might be just the case here. I actually tend not to mess with those image options too much. I find that in many cases, it doesn't really do a whole lot of difference, but obviously if you want to like reflect the image, you would have to upload it individually. And I could probably do that if I just like changed my input here and just like found that one single image I wanted. So if I went here, I think I could switch that to just be like a single image. But yeah, it's, you know, this is a small company running on lots of different things. So like, it's definitely like not always the perfect setup for this. So I actually wonder if I have other things. So let's try this on a more abstract image. If I can find one that isn't gonna take forever to upload. Well, here there's only, let's just give it a shot and see what happens here. So when it uploads files, it's gonna like upload, it's gonna like try to load every single one of them in here, which is gonna take a little bit of time. While I do this, other questions?
So you did mention that, for example, you can have different, like, so like, could you combine 2 to 3 things in one, kind of like, if that makes any sense? Like,
yeah, so,
I guess in your workspaces?
Yeah, so I would recommend, we'll look at that more next week. I would recommend trying it this week and see how you do. The key thing to know about it is that your inputs and outputs have to match. And by chaining, it actually is like it's a sort of stacks top to bottom. So you have to make sure that the first one, your output matches the input of the second one, your output of the second one matches the input of the third one. I recommend just playing with it and see if you can figure out to get it to work, and we'll look at it more next week. But yes, you can. And that's a pretty common thing actually to people add like that super resolution network at the end of a chain. So that way you get a higher resolution image out of it at the end. So this is actually kind of fun. This is like pretty much what most of my work looks like, which is like I take in an abstract image and I do something else to it, and you get a different image out of it. And this model is surprisingly flexible. It works fairly well with these things. It's not perfect. I would say that if I trained this on this data set and a flower data set, I would get better results. But I can at least sort of see what this is going to look like. Cool. Other questions? Okay. So always make sure you stop your model. Again, I do think they have an auto stop feature that stops after a little bit of inactivity, but save yourself those 20 cents or whatever, and make sure you hit stop model. Let me just quickly go back to my slides here, and we'll talk about. So last thing to know is, so the homework for this week is just to literally go through the model interface inside of Runway and just find some models to play with. So you can just dig through and find something and open it and see if you can get it to work. There's also a playlist of demos that I have here on my YouTube channel. So you can go through those and find a bunch of them. We can actually just pop this open and I can tell you a little bit which ones are worth digging into. So this contains sort of a lot of different Runway features, many of which we'll go over in this class. But if you're interested in some of these, you can take a look at them ahead of time. But we've got some stuff here at the bottom. So I go over Munit here. Here's one on object background. Here's one on Big GAN, Big BiGAN. So again, you could start here and just sort of like follow along or like play with them that way. Or what I might recommend is just like dig in, find one you like are interested in, play with it so you can get it to figure out by yourself. And if you can't, and if there's a video here, you can watch it. But if there isn't a video, like let me know and we can try to walk through it together at some point. So another thing to note is like, you're always welcome to reach out to me pretty much at any time. Just drop a note in Slack or DM me on Slack and I'm happy to like, when I am available, like to give you some feedback or help walk through things. So it's very flexible. Like you don't have to wait till next week to talk to me again. Yeah, so basically your homework is just sort of like play with some models, figure out how to make it work, make some funky, funny things. I would love if people would just like over the next week, like post some examples in Slack. If you made a cool image, like let us know how you made it, what model you used. If you have questions about it, like ask a question in Slack and I'm happy to answer there. So this is gonna be a little bit of like just throwing you in the deep end, like have at it, play with it. You might fail a couple times and the hope is that like, if you do fail, either ask me this week or come to class next week with questions. And next week we'll look at a little bit of this, some more examples of some specific model types. And then we'll talk about some other things as well. Lastly, if you like, I would start to think about like maybe what projects you're interested in working on. One thing I should also note is that on my YouTube channel, there's a ton of other videos in here, including maybe some projects. Like actually, let's just type inspiration. Oh wait, that's not in my channel. YouTube is funky in that you have to search specifically here to look within my videos. And because I can't spell it, couldn't find anything. So there are some videos here about like various inspirational projects, other things that I've already gone through. I definitely recommend checking out, if you just look through the playlist, you'll see that there are previous classes I've taught here, and there are some things like inspiration projects and other things you might be interested in going through. Next week, I'll show some projects of people of stuff people have made in Runway, but if you're interested in jumping ahead, you can go ahead and take a look at that. Yeah, there's a ton of videos here on my channel if you're interested in digging into more. But yeah, I would say like just start by playing around and seeing what you find. Cool. Go for it. Yeah.
This area here with all the videos is going to be found on the Slack channel, or this is
just my YouTube. This is my YouTube channel. So the link that's here will take you directly to the Runway playlist. So this will be stuff only about Runway. I teach a ton of classes around a ton of different materials. So some of this will not be about Runway, but might get you inspired and you might want to be like, how could I do that in Runway? Or like, is there a way to do that inside of Runway? So I definitely recommend like just digging around and sort of seeing what's available in here. This is definitely the fire hose. I wouldn't expect anyone to be able to like understand what any of this is, but if you go to playlists here at the top, some of this is broken down in a playlist. So you've got, I'm currently teaching a class in Colab if you're interested in that. But there's also a lot of Runway courses. This happens to be the most popular class I teach. So I teach a lot of different ones. But there's other stuff in here, like just a bunch of my artwork and my videos, as well as other topics in here. So you can sort of dig around. I would generally say like, you'll be fine if you just like play around in Runway yourself and like figure things out. You'll learn more that way. But there's a lot of materials here if you're interested in it. I'll post a link to this as well for folks. Any other questions? Week 1 is always like, everyone just sort of like, I don't even know what to ask yet. Next week, I'm sure everyone will have many, many questions about various models they play with and whatnot. So sure, we'll have a lot more questions next week. Was everyone able to get the coupon to work? Okay, cool. So if you haven't done that yet, I would definitely make sure you do that before next week, just in case there are issues. I'm going to reach out to Chris this week just to make sure everyone has gotten the ability to do training. So what I would say is I sent everyone an email. If you could check that email address and make sure your email address is also the email address you signed up for at Runway. If you use a different email address, can you just let me know? Because what I'm going to have, Chris will basically like just turn a flag on your account. So they don't match up. We'll just have to figure out which one you're on. But yeah, so just like take a look at that and let me know if you have a different account or a different email address under it. So I can make sure that you get the ability to train. We won't use it next week, but we'll use it the week after. So as long as you have that turned on in the near future, that'll be really good. All right. Everyone have a good sense of what they want to do between, or what they're going to do between now and next week? All right, awesome. So again, please feel free to drop notes in Slack. All of the video up for this at the end of, in like the next hour or two. So please feel free to reach out if you have questions or if you're interested in doing something in particular and you don't know where it is in Runway, I'll help try to find it for you. And we'll see everyone next week then. Cool. All right.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah,
Yep.
see everybody next week. All right,
Thank you.
bye.